Elena's hands were shaking when she saw her own name written on the treaty, not as a witness, not as a guest, as payment. She stood at the edge of the great hall, half hidden behind a stone pillar, and stared at the parchment spread across the table, between two men who hated each other more than they hated death itself. One of those men was Damien, the Alpha King she had loved since she was 16 years old. The other was Cain, the Alpha of the Blackthorn Pack, a man whose name was used in her kingdom to frighten children into behaving. "You cannot be serious," said one of the older council members, Edwin, his voice low so it would not carry. "Sending her there, to him. It is the only way to stop the war," Damien answered, not even lifting his eyes from the treaty. "Blackthorn wants a guarantee that this peace will hold. A person from my own bloodline, given freely, tied to their pack. That is what guarantees peace among wolves. You know this." Elena's chest went tight. Freely. He had said freely, as if she had agreed to any of this, as if anyone had bothered to walk down the hallway to her chambers and ask her opinion before deciding to trade her like a bag of grain. She stepped out from behind the pillar, because hiding suddenly felt worse than facing it. "When were you going to tell me?" she asked. The room went silent. Every advisor, every guard, every servant turned to look at her, and then quickly looked away, because no one wanted to be caught watching the moment a king's promise to a woman fell apart in public. Damien finally raised his eyes. For a moment, something flickered there. Regret, maybe, or something closer to guilt. But it did not last long enough for her to be sure it was real. "Elena," he said, and his voice had the same calm, practiced gentleness he used when addressing the whole kingdom. "This is bigger than us. You understand that. A war is coming. Thousands of lives are at risk. I need this truce." "You need it," she repeated. "So you're giving me away to get it." "I am not giving you away." He said it firmly, as if saying it firmly would make it true. "I am asking you to make a sacrifice for your people, for me." Elena looked down at the treaty again, her name, written in careful ink, beside a clause about safe passage and pack loyalty, and a marking ceremony that would bind her to Blackthorn territory. There was no mention of her voice in any of it, no mention of choice. "You told me once," she said quietly, "that I would stand beside you as your mate, that I would rule with you." Damien's jaw tightened. "Things change, Elena. Kingdoms come before promises made in private." That was the moment something inside her went cold and still, like a lake freezing over in a single night. She had spent years believing that her devotion mattered, that her patience would be rewarded, that the boy who once held her hand at the edge of the training field and told her she would be his queen had meant it. She realized now that promise had only ever been useful to him when it was convenient. "Say it," she said. "Say what this actually is." Damien did not answer. Edwin, the older advisor, stepped forward instead, his voice gentler than the king's. "It is an exchange, my lady. For peace. Alpha Cain demanded a member of the royal bloodline as a symbol of trust between our packs. You were chosen because I was the easiest to give away," Elena finished for him. "Because I have no army behind me, no pack of my own to object." No one corrected her. She thought about running. For one wild second, the idea burned through her, hot and desperate. Take a horse, ride into the forest, disappear into the hills where no Alpha's law could reach her. But she knew what happened to wolves who broke a signed truce before it began. It would not only cost her. It would cost everyone loyal to her, everyone who had ever shown her kindness in that castle. Her own mother had died serving this kingdom. She would not be the reason it burned. So instead, she lifted her chin, the way her mother had taught her to do when the world tried to make her feel small, and she said the only thing she had left to say. "Then I will go, but do not ever again pretend this was my choice." She turned and walked out of the hall. Before anyone could see her eyes fill with tears, she refused to let fall in front of them. That night, Elena did not sleep. She sat by her window, looking out over the kingdom she had called home her whole life, watching torchlight flicker along the outer walls, where guards kept watch for enemies, who, as of tomorrow, would no longer be enemies. Not officially, not on paper. Her maid, Mira, came in quietly and sat beside her without asking permission, the way old friends do. "They say Blackthorn territory is nothing but stone and shadow," Mira whispered, "that the Alpha there, has no mercy in him, that he took his throne by force and has ruled it with an iron grip ever since. Elena wrapped her arms around her knees. Then I suppose I will learn quickly how to survive iron. You could refuse, Mira said, though she did not sound like she believed it herself. I could, Elena admitted, and thousands could die in the fighting that follows. I have seen what war does to this land, Mira. I watched my own mother carried home on a shield. I will not be the reason it happens again, not when I have a way to stop it. Mira's eyes glistened. You are braver than any of them in that hall. I am not brave, Elena said, and for the first time that night, her voice cracked. I am just out of choices. The morning came too fast. Elena dressed in a traveling cloak the color of dried blood, though no one dared call it that in front of her, and she was led out to the courtyard where a small procession waited to take her to the border of Blackthorn territory. Guards, a few wagons carrying what little of her belongings she was allowed to bring, and Damien, standing at the top of the stone steps, watching her go with an expression she could not read. He came down to meet her as she reached the gate. Elena, he said. She did not stop walking. Elena, please. He caught her arm, gently, the way he used to when they were younger, and he wanted her to slow down and look at something beautiful with him. A sunset, a field of wildflowers, the first snow of winter. She used to love that touch. Now it felt like a chain. She turned to face him, and for one moment, she let him see everything she felt. All the years of loyalty, all the nights she had waited for him to notice her, all the promises she had believed without question. And now, all the wreckage of what those promises had become. You once told me, she said, that a true alpha protects what belongs to him. I was foolish enough to think that meant me. Damien's grip loosened. This truce will save lives. I know, Elena said. That is the only reason I am walking through that gate, instead of screaming, until this whole castle understands what you have done. She pulled her arm free and did not look back again. The road to Blackthorn territory was long, winding through forests that grew darker and thicker the farther they traveled from her home. The guards who escorted her spoke little, and what they did say was in hushed, uneasy tones, as if the trees themselves might report their words back to someone dangerous. Elena watched the landscape change outside the wagon window, the friendly, cultivated fields of her kingdom giving way to wild, untamed country, jagged hills rising like the backs of sleeping beasts, and finally, in the distance, a fortress carved into black stone, its towers sharp as claws against the gray sky. Blackthorn Castle. Her stomach twisted at the sight of it. Every story she had ever heard about Alpha Cain came rushing back to her at once. That he had clawed his way to power over the bodies of his own rivals. That he trusted no one, loved no one, and ruled through fear alone. That he had once, so the rumor went, turned away an entire delegation of peace-seekers and let their pack fall to ruin rather than offer them mercy. She did not know how much of it was true. She only knew that within the hour, she would belong to him, at least on paper, and there would be no more running from whatever waited behind those black stone walls. The procession slowed as they reached the outer gates. Warriors in dark armor lined the path, their eyes tracking the wagon with quiet, unreadable interest. None of them spoke. None of them smiled. Elena straightened her spine and reminded herself, again and again, that she had survived worse than silence. She had survived betrayal. She could survive this. The wagon came to a stop in a wide stone courtyard, and for a long moment, nobody moved. Elena sat with her hands folded in her lap, waiting, listening to her own heartbeat pound in her ears. Then the door of the wagon opened, and a hand appeared, offering to help her down. She looked up and found herself staring into a face that matched none of the stories she had been told. He was younger than she expected, though there was nothing young about the way he carried himself. His eyes were a deep, storm-colored gray, sharp and assessing, taking in every detail of her without a single word wasted. He wore no crown, no jewels, nothing to announce his rank, except the way every warrior in that courtyard straightened when he stepped forward. "You must be Elena," he said. His voice was low, controlled, giving nothing away. "I am," she answered, refusing to let her voice shake. "I am Cain." He studied her for a moment longer, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not name what it was. "You were not told the full terms of this arrangement, were you?" The question startled her. What do you mean? I mean, Kane said, glancing briefly at the guards around them before returning his attention to her, that your king signed away more than a truce. Come inside, we will speak where fewer ears are listening. Elena hesitated only a moment before stepping down from the wagon, her boots meeting the cold stone of a courtyard that would, for better or worse, now be part of her life. She followed the man the world called a monster into the fortress that was supposed to be her prison, and she told herself, with every step, that she would not let this place, or this man, break what little was left of her. Whatever waited inside those walls, she would face it standing. The inside of Blackthorn Castle was nothing like Elena had pictured. She had imagined dark, dripping corridors and cold stone rooms without a single fire lit, a place built to match its master's reputation. Instead, she found wide halls with tall windows that let in streams of gray daylight, tapestries showing old battles and older harvests, and warmth coming from hearths that had clearly been burning for hours before her arrival. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she had prepared for. This quiet order was something else entirely. Kane led her through the halls without speaking, his stride even and unhurried, as if her arrival meant nothing at all to him. Servants and warriors alike stepped aside as he passed, some offering brief nods, none of them daring to meet her eyes for long. She felt like a curiosity being carried through a market, not a person walking on her own 2 feet. Finally, he stopped at a set of heavy wooden doors and pushed them open, revealing a private study lined with shelves of old books and maps pinned to the walls, marked with routes and borders she did not recognize. He gestured for her to sit in a chair near the fire, then took the seat across from her, folding his hands together as he studied her face again with that same unreadable calm. You said I wasn't told the full terms, Elena said, before he could speak first. She was tired of being the last to know things about her own life. Tell me now. Kane's eyes did not waver from hers. Your king agreed to more than a symbolic exchange. He agreed that you would remain here, under my authority, until I judged the truce to be secure. There is no set date for your return. There may never be one. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood about her situation. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that this was temporary, a ceremony, a season, a year at most, and then she would be allowed to go home, changed but free. Hearing that there was no promised end to it felt like watching the last door close behind her. He didn't tell me that, she said quietly. I assumed as much. Kane's voice was flat, but not unkind. It would not have served him to be honest with you before you arrived. Easier for a king to send away a problem than to explain the true price of the peace he is buying. Elena's hands curled into fists in her lap. You speak of him with a great deal of contempt for a man you just signed a truce with. I have no love for Damien, Kane said simply. I have love for peace, and peace was worth the cost of dealing with a man like him. He paused, studying her again in that careful, searching way. You, however, are not a cost to me. You are a person who has been used as one. There is a difference, and I intend to treat you accordingly. Elena did not know what to do with those words. She had prepared herself for cruelty, for indifference, for being treated as property, the way she had been treated in the final days of her own kingdom. She had not prepared for a stranger, a man with a fearsome reputation, speaking to her as if her dignity mattered. Why would you care how I am treated? She asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. I am nothing to you, a piece in your truce. Something flickered across Kane's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Because I know what it feels like to be treated as a piece rather than a person, he said. I will not explain further tonight. You have had a long journey, and there will be time enough for old stories later, if you ever wish to hear mine. He rose from his chair and crossed to the door, pausing before he opened it. You are not a prisoner here, Elena, though I understand if you do not believe that yet. You will have your own chambers, your own freedom to move through the castle grounds, and no one here will lay a hand on you without consequence. What I ask in return is patience and honesty for as long as this arrangement lasts. And if I refuse to be patient? She asked, lifting her chin. For the first time, something close to a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it did not reach his eyes. Then you will be the first person in this castle brave enough to argue with me. I imagine that will make the coming months interesting. at the very least. He left her there with those words, and Elena sat by the fire long after the door had closed, turning his strange kindness over in her mind, like a coin she could not decide was real or counterfeit. A young woman arrived not long after to show her to her chambers. She introduced herself as Grace, one of the castle's household staff, with kind eyes and a quick, nervous smile that suggested she was not used to speaking freely with guests of Elena's rank. The chambers themselves surprised Elena again, spacious, warm, with a wide bed draped in soft furs and a balcony that looked out over the hills beyond the fortress walls. It was not the cold stone cell she had imagined lying awake in the previous night. "The Alpha ordered this room prepared for you personally," Grace said, setting down a tray of food on the table near the window. "He does not usually take such interest in guest arrangements." "I am not exactly a guest," Elena said. Grace hesitated, clearly unsure how much she was allowed to say. "No, my lady. I suppose you are not. But you are also not what the others expected." "What did they expect?" "Someone weaker," Grace admitted, a little sheepishly. "Someone who would arrive in tears and refuse to leave her chambers for weeks. You walked through that gate with your back straight and your eyes forward. The warriors noticed. They talk, even when they think no one is listening." Elena managed a small, tired smile at that, the first genuine one since she had left her home behind. "I suppose I did not have the luxury of falling apart in front of an audience." "No," Grace agreed softly. "I suppose you did not." That night, Elena lay awake again, though this time it was not fear keeping her from sleep. It was confusion. Everything she had been told about Cain, about Blackthorn territory, about the fate that awaited her here, had been wrong, or at least incomplete. The man she had met was careful with his words, sharp-eyed, guarded, but not cruel. Not the monster of the stories her own people whispered about at night to frighten their children into obedience. She thought of Damien, of the way he had held her hand in front of the entire council, and called this arrangement a sacrifice worth making, as if her life were a coin he could spend without consequence. She thought of the years she had spent believing herself chosen, only to learn she had been convenient, and she thought of Cain's quiet, unreadable eyes, and the strange promise he had made her, that she was not a prisoner, that her dignity would be respected, that patience and honesty were the only price of her stay. She did not trust it, not yet. Trust, she had learned, was expensive, and she had already paid too much of it, to a man who had spent it carelessly. But she found herself, despite everything, curious about the man who ruled this fortress. Curious about what had shaped him into someone who understood so precisely what it felt like to be treated as a piece rather than a person. Curious, and a little afraid of how easily that curiosity might grow into something more dangerous than fear. In the days that followed, Elena began to learn the rhythms of Blackthorn Castle. She rose early, before most of the household stirred, and walked the halls while the light was still soft and gray, watching warriors train in the courtyard below her window, listening to the low murmur of servants preparing the day's meals. She was given freedom to explore, as Cain had promised, though she noticed she was rarely, if ever, truly alone. Guards kept a respectful distance but never let her out of sight for long, a fact that reminded her, gently but firmly, of the boundaries of her new life. She met Owen, the captain of Cain's personal guard, a broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh, who seemed determined to make her feel welcome, despite the tension of her arrival. She met Callum, an older advisor with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, who watched her with open suspicion for the first several days, clearly unconvinced that a woman handed over by an enemy king could be trusted within these walls. And she saw Cain, though never for long, always passing through the castle on some matter of governance, always offering her a brief nod of acknowledgement before continuing on his way, as if giving her time and space to find her footing without pressing himself into it. It was during one of these early mornings, standing on the balcony outside her chambers and watching mist curl over the hills, that Elena allowed herself, for the first time since leaving her home, to imagine a version of her future that did not revolve entirely around loss. She did not know yet what that future would look like. She only knew that somewhere between the betrayal that had brought her here and the quiet, careful kindness that had greeted her upon arrival, something in her had begun, slowly and cautiously, to shift. 3 weeks into her stay, Elena discovered that Blackthorn territory held a secret she had not expected. The people here did not fear their alpha the way her own kingdom's stories claimed. They respected him, certainly, and some kept a careful distance out of caution, but the terror she had been promised was nowhere to be found. Farmers greeted him with familiar nods when he rode through their fields. Children did not scatter at the sight of him. An old woman selling bread in the market square once scolded him for skipping a meal, and he had taken the correction with something close to patience, even amusement. Elena watched this from a distance one afternoon, standing near the market stalls with Grace at her side, and found herself struggling to reconcile the man before her with the monster her own people had described for years. "He does not seem cruel," she said carefully, testing the words in her mouth, as though they might betray her. Grace glanced at her sideways. He was not always like this, or so the older staff say. When he first took the throne, he was harder, colder. It took time for him to become the alpha you see now. Grace hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was close enough to hear. "That is not my story to tell, my lady. If you want to know, you should ask him yourself." Elena did not ask him that day, or the next, though the question lingered in the back of her mind, like an unlit candle waiting for a spark. Instead, she found herself drawn into the quiet work of settling into a life she had not chosen, learning the names of the servants, memorizing the layout of the castle's many halls, and slowly, carefully, testing the boundaries of the freedom Cain had promised her. It was during a council meeting, one she had not been invited to but had wandered close enough to overhear, that she first saw a different side of him. The topic was a dispute over grazing land between two smaller packs under Blackthorn's protection, a matter that had apparently dragged on for months without resolution. Elena listened from the hallway as voices rose and fell, as Callum argued for a strict, unforgiving ruling, and as another advisor pushed for compromise. Cain's voice, when it finally cut through the argument, was calm but firm. "You are both approaching this as though one side must lose everything for the other to gain anything. That is not leadership. That is laziness, dressed up as decisiveness." There was a long pause before anyone spoke again. "Then what would you have us do, Alpha?" Callum asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would complicate his life considerably. "Find the solution that costs both sides the least," Cain said, "not the one that lets you close the matter fastest. If it takes longer, it takes longer. My people will remember whether I was fair to them far longer than they will remember whether I was fast." Elena stood frozen in the hallway, listening to a man the world had painted as ruthless argue passionately for fairness over convenience. It did not match anything she had been told. It did not match anything she had expected. She was still standing there, lost in thought, when the council meeting ended, and the doors opened sooner than she anticipated. Cain stepped out first, and their eyes met before she could retreat. "Eavesdropping, Elena?" he asked, though there was no real accusation in his voice, only the faintest trace of dry humor. Heat rushed to her cheeks. "I was passing through," she said, which was not entirely a lie, though it was not entirely the truth either. Cain studied her for a moment, and something in his expression softened just slightly. "You may attend council meetings, if you wish, openly, rather than from a hallway. I imagine you have opinions worth hearing, given the kingdom you were raised in." The offer startled her. In her own home, in the kingdom she had grown up in, she had never once been invited into a council chamber. Her voice had never been considered worth the space it would take up in a room full of men making decisions about lives, including her own. And here, in the fortress she had arrived at as a prisoner, a stranger was offering her a seat at the table, simply because he assumed she might have something worth saying. "Why would you want my opinion?" she asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "I know nothing of Blackthorn's people, or its lands." "No," Cain agreed, "but you know what it is to be governed by someone who forgot you were a person, and not a resource. That perspective is worth more in this room than you seem to realize." Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, and Cain, seeming to understand her silence, simply nodded once and continued down the hallway, leaving her standing there, with a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. Over the following weeks, she began attending council meetings, cautiously at first, seated near the back of the room, saying little, listening carefully to the way disputes were handled, the way Cain weighed each side before offering judgment. She learned that Callum's sharpness came from years of protecting Cain from threats both real and imagined, a loyalty so fierce it sometimes clouded his fairness. She learned that Owen, despite his booming laugh and easy friendliness, held some of the sharpest strategic instincts in the entire fortress. And she learned, slowly, that Cain listened more than he spoke, weighing every voice in the room before he offered his own, a habit that felt entirely foreign after years of watching Damien speak first and loudest, expecting the room to fall in line behind him. One evening, after a particularly long council session concerning a dispute with a neighboring pack, Elena found herself walking the same hallway as Cain, both of them heading toward the same wing of the castle. The torches along the walls burned low, casting long shadows across the stone floor, and for a while neither of them spoke. "You disagreed with my ruling today," Cain said finally, breaking the silence. "I could see it on your face." Elena hesitated, unsure whether honesty was welcome, or whether it would be seen as overstepping the careful boundaries she had been navigating since her arrival. But something about the quiet of the hallway, the absence of an audience, made the words come easier. "I thought you were too lenient," she admitted. "The pack that broke the agreement should have faced harsher consequences. Otherwise, what reason do they have not to break the next one?" Cain considered this for a long moment. "You may be right," he said, surprising her. "Or you may be wrong. I will not know until I see whether they honor the new terms. That is the difficulty of leadership, Elena. You rarely get to know if your choice was correct, until long after you have made it, and by then, it is too late to choose differently." "That sounds exhausting," she said. "It is," he agreed, and for the first time, she heard something almost weary in his voice, a crack in the calm, patrolled exterior he wore like armor. "But it is a burden I chose, and one I intend to carry properly, even when it costs me sleep." They reached the place where their paths would diverge, and Cain paused before turning down his own corridor. "Thank you," Elena said suddenly, before she could stop herself. He glanced back at her, one eyebrow raised slightly. "For what?" "For treating my opinion as though it mattered," she said. "It has been a long time since anyone did that." Something shifted in his expression, something she could not quite name, gentler than the calculated calm he usually wore. "Then whoever failed to do so before did not deserve the privilege of your opinion in the first place," he said quietly, and then he was gone, disappearing down the dim corridor, leaving Elena standing alone, with her heart beating a little faster than she wanted to admit. That night, lying awake in the soft furs of her bed, Elena found herself thinking not of Damien, not of the kingdom she had left behind, but of gray eyes that studied her, as though she were a person worth understanding, and a voice that had called her opinion a privilege rather than an inconvenience. She did not know what to make of the warmth spreading slowly through her chest, and for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Castle, she was not entirely sure she wanted it to stop. Grief does not disappear simply because a new life begins around it. Elena learned this slowly, in the quiet hours between council meetings and long walks through the castle grounds, when the busyness of the day fell away and left her alone with the truth of everything she had lost. She would catch herself staring out the window during meals, remembering the sound of Damien's laughter across a dinner table, or the way he used to trace patterns on her palm when they sat together by the fire, before she understood that those gestures had meant far less to him than they had meant to her. It was Owen who found her one evening, sitting alone on a low stone wall at the edge of the training yard, staring out at nothing in particular, while the sun sank behind the hills. "You have the look of someone carrying something heavy," he said, settling onto the wall beside her without waiting for permission, which she had already learned was simply his way. "I am fine," she said automatically, the same practiced answer she had been giving since her arrival. Owen huffed out a laugh that held no cruelty in it. "You say that the way people say it when they are the opposite of fine. I have known Cain a long time. I have learned to recognize the sound of someone pretending." Elena studied him for a moment, weighing whether to let the mask slip even slightly in front of a man she barely knew. But something about Owen's easy manner, his complete lack of judgment, made the words come loose before she could stop them. "I spent years believing I would marry a man who loved me," she said quietly. "I built my entire future around that belief, and in the space of one afternoon, I learned I was never anything more to him than a convenient solution to a political problem." She laughed, though there was no humor in it. "I do not know how to stop grieving something that was never real in the first place." Owen was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade over the hills. "I think," he said carefully, "that the thing you are grieving was real. Not because he meant it, but because you did. Your love was real, even if his was not. That is worth grieving, even if it is a hard thing to sit with." Elena felt something in her chest loosen slightly at those words, as though someone had finally given her permission to feel the full weight of what she had lost, without also feeling foolish for having lost it. "Does it get easier?" she asked. "This feeling?" "It changes," Owen said. "I will not lie and tell you it disappears entirely. But it changes shape. Eventually it stops being the only thing you feel, and starts being one thing among many. Give it time." They sat together in comfortable silence until the last light disappeared entirely, and when Elena finally rose to return to her chambers, she felt lighter than she had in weeks, as though speaking the grief aloud had loosened its grip on her chest, even if only slightly. The days that followed brought new challenges of their own. Word had begun to spread through Blackthorn territory that the Truce bride from the neighboring kingdom was not the broken, silent figure many had expected. Some of the older warriors regarded her with open suspicion, unwilling to trust anyone connected to Damien's bloodline, regardless of how she had come to be there. Others were simply curious, watching her from a distance as she moved through the castle grounds, attended council meetings, and slowly began to carve out a place for herself, within walls that were never meant to be her home. Callum remained the most difficult to win over. He had served Cain since before the Alpha had claimed his throne, and his loyalty ran deep enough that anything connected to Blackthorn's old enemies triggered an instinctive wariness he made little effort to hide. "You should not be in this room," he said one afternoon, when Elena arrived early to a council session and found him already seated at the long table, reviewing reports by candlelight. "The Alpha invited me," Elena replied evenly, refusing to let his tone rattle her. "The Alpha," Callum said, setting down his papers with deliberate care, "has a habit of extending trust before it has been earned. It is one of his few weaknesses." "Or one of his strengths," Elena countered. "Trust given freely is often returned in kind. Perhaps you have simply never tested that theory." Callum's eyes narrowed slightly, though something in his expression suggested he was reassessing her, even if only a little. "You have a sharp tongue for someone who arrived here in chains, of a sort." "I arrived here with no chains at all," Elena said. "Only a signed piece of paper and the ashes of every promise I once believed in. I would think that gives me more reason than most to understand exactly what trust is worth, and exactly what it costs when it is broken." For a long moment, Callum said nothing, simply studying her, with the same careful, assessing look Cain so often wore. Finally he nodded once, a small, grudging gesture that Elena suspected was the closest thing to respect the older advisor was willing to offer so soon. "We will see," he said, and returned to his papers, leaving Elena to wonder if she had won a small victory or simply postponed a larger battle. It was during this same period that Elena began to notice small, quiet changes in the way Cain behaved around her. He began seeking her opinion more directly during council sessions, asking her thoughts on matters of trade and diplomacy that drew on the knowledge she had gathered growing up within Damien's court. He began arranging his schedule, subtly but unmistakably, so that he crossed paths with her during her morning walks along the castle's outer walls, offering brief conversations about nothing in particular that nonetheless left her smiling long after he had gone. One morning, walking together along a stretch of wall overlooking the hills, Elena found herself asking the question she had been holding back since her earliest conversation with Grace. "What changed you?" she asked. "The people here speak of you as though you were a different man once. Harder, colder." Cain's steps slowed slightly, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer. But then he spoke, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of its usual careful control. "I was raised to believe that softness was a weakness that would get me killed," he said. "My father ruled through fear alone, and he taught me to do the same. When I took this throne, I ruled the way he had taught me to rule, and for a long time, I believed that was the only way to survive." He paused, looking out over the hills. "It took losing someone I cared for, someone I failed to protect, because I was too focused on appearing strong, instead of actually being wise, to understand that fear and respect are not the same thing, and that a leader who only knows how to inspire the first will eventually lose everything to a leader who has learned to earn the second. Elena studied his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the weight visible in his eyes even now, years removed from whatever loss he was describing. "I am sorry," she said softly, "for whoever you lost." "So am I," Kane said, "but I have learned to carry it forward instead of letting it define me. Some days that is easier than others." They walked in silence for a while after that, and Elena found herself understanding him a little more clearly, understanding the careful, deliberate fairness he brought to every decision, the patience he extended to a woman who had arrived at his gates as a stranger and, in some ways, an enemy. By the time they reached the end of the wall, where the path curved back toward the castle, Elena realized with a small, startled jolt that she had stopped thinking of Blackthorn as a prison, and started thinking of it, cautiously, and against every instinct telling her not to, as something closer to a home. The test of her place within Blackthorn came sooner than Elena expected, and it arrived not as a grand challenge but as a quiet, ordinary crisis that revealed exactly how far she had come. A messenger arrived one gray morning, with news that a smaller pack allied with Blackthorn had been struck by a sickness spreading quickly through its livestock, threatening to leave dozens of families without food before winter set in. The council convened at once, voices rising over how best to respond, whether to send grain from Blackthorn's own stores or wait to see if the sickness could be contained before committing valuable resources. Elena listened to the arguments circle, without resolution, for nearly an hour before she finally spoke, her voice cutting through the debate with a calm authority she had not known she possessed. "You are all arguing about how much grain to send," she said, "when the real problem is that no one has asked why the sickness started in the first place. If it came from contaminated water, sending grain alone will not save those families. It will only delay the same crisis by a season." The room fell silent. Callum, seated near the head of the table, studied her, with an expression she had never seen him wear before, something closer to genuine consideration than suspicion. "What would you suggest instead?" Kane asked, and though his tone was even, she could hear the interest beneath it. "Send healers alongside the grain," Elena said. "Someone who can identify the cause of the sickness before it spreads further. I have seen outbreaks like this before, in my own kingdom, years ago. If it is not addressed at the source, no amount of grain will be enough to save them." Kane held her gaze for a long moment, and then he turned to the rest of the council. "Send for the healers. Elena will accompany them, along with a small escort, to advise on what she has seen before." The room stirred with quiet murmurs of surprise, but no one openly objected, not even Callum, who simply nodded once and began organizing the logistics of the journey, without further argument. The following days were unlike anything Elena had experienced since arriving at Blackthorn. She traveled with the healers and a small group of warriors to the afflicted pack's territory, where she found conditions far worse than the messenger's report had suggested. Families huddled in modest homes, worry etched into every face, while what remained of their livestock grew weaker by the day. Elena worked alongside the healers, drawing on knowledge she had gathered during her years in Damien's court, when a similar outbreak had struck a border village, and she had spent weeks studying the response alongside her mother. It was grueling work, filled with long hours and few comforts, but Elena found herself thriving in ways she had not expected. She organized the distribution of clean water, coordinated with local farmers to isolate the healthiest animals from the sick ones, and spent evenings speaking with families who had lost nearly everything, offering what comfort she could, alongside practical guidance for rebuilding what had been lost. By the end of the second week, the sickness had begun to slow, and gratitude replaced fear in the eyes of the people she had come to help. An older farmer, his hands rough from decades of labor, approached her on the final evening before her return to Blackthorn Castle, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We did not expect help to come so quickly," he said, "especially not from someone connected to Damien's kingdom. Forgive me for saying so plainly." "You have nothing to apologize for," Elena said gently. "I understand the suspicion, but I am not here as a representative of that kingdom any longer. I am here because your people needed help, and I had knowledge that could provide it." The farmer studied her for a long moment, then bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect she had not expected and would not soon forget. "Then Blackthorn is fortunate to have you, whatever the circumstances that brought you here." When Elena returned to the castle, word of her work had already traveled ahead of her. Warriors who had once regarded her with quiet suspicion now offered respectful nods as she passed through the halls. Servants spoke of her efforts with open admiration. Even Callum, when she encountered him in the council chamber upon her return, greeted her with something that, for the first time, resembled genuine warmth. "You handled that situation better than most seasoned diplomats would have," he admitted, the words clearly costing him some effort. "I confess, I did not expect that from you." "I understand," Elena said. "You had no reason to expect anything from me at all, except perhaps trouble." Callum allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "Perhaps. But I have learned, over many years of service, that the wisest course is to judge people by their actions, rather than their bloodlines. Yours have spoken well of you." That evening, Kane sought her out on the same stretch of wall where they had first spoken openly of the things that had shaped them. He found her watching the sunset, her expression thoughtful, tired in the way that comes from meaningful work rather than despair. "The council is impressed," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Callum spoke of you today, with something close to respect. That is rarer than you might realize." "I only did what needed to be done," Elena said. "Anyone would have done the same, given the knowledge." "Not anyone," Kane said. "Many would have stayed within these walls, content to let the healers handle the matter alone. You chose to go, to work alongside them, to sit with families who had every reason to distrust you, and earn their trust regardless. That is not something everyone is capable of." Elena turned to look at him, studying the sincerity in his expression, the quiet respect that had replaced the careful, guarded distance he had maintained since her arrival. "I did not do it to earn anyone's respect," she said honestly. "I did it because it needed doing, and because I finally had the chance to matter to someone besides myself." "You have always mattered," Kane said quietly. "Perhaps it simply took the right circumstances for you to see it." The words settled over her like warmth spreading through cold hands, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply standing together as the last light faded from the sky. Elena realized, with a clarity that both frightened and steadied her, that she was beginning to build something within these walls that had nothing to do with the truce that had brought her here, and everything to do with the person she was slowly, carefully, becoming. In the weeks that followed, Kane began including her more directly in matters of governance, seeking her counsel on trade agreements and diplomatic correspondence, trusting her judgment in ways that no one, not even Damien, had ever trusted her before. Elena found herself rising earlier, working later, throwing herself into the rhythms of Blackthorn's leadership with an energy she had not felt since before her mother's death, when purpose had still felt like something within her reach. She did not know, not yet, how far this path would take her, or what it would cost her when word of her growing influence eventually reached the kingdom she had left behind. She only knew that for the first time since the day her name had appeared on that treaty, she felt like more than a piece traded away to secure someone else's peace. She felt, slowly and against every expectation she had carried through Blackthorn's gates, like herself again. Autumn settled over Blackthorn territory, with a sharpness that reminded everyone winter was not far behind, and with it came a new kind of tension that Elena had not anticipated. A neighboring pack, one that had long resented Blackthorn's growing influence, began testing the borders with small provocations, minor raids on outlying farms, disputes over hunting rights that escalated faster than they should have. It was nothing that threatened outright war, not yet, but it was enough to keep the council's meetings tense, and Kane's expression more guarded than she had seen it in weeks. Elena found herself drawn increasingly into these discussions, her outsider's perspective proving useful in ways even she had not expected. Having grown up watching Damien navigate disputes with careful, sometimes ruthless calculation, she understood patterns of provocation that Kane's advisors, more accustomed to Blackthorn's straightforward style of leadership, sometimes missed entirely. "They are not testing your borders because they want the land," she said, during one particularly heated council session, after Callum had proposed a swift, forceful response to the latest raid. "They are testing whether Blackthorn's alliance with my former kingdom has weakened your resolve. They want to see if the truce has made you cautious." Kane studied her closely. "Explain." A show of overwhelming force this early would confirm their suspicions and invite more testing, Elena continued. But ignoring it entirely would suggest weakness. What you need is a response precise enough to demonstrate strength, without escalating the conflict into something neither side actually wants. Callum, though clearly still adjusting to taking military advice from a woman raised in a rival court, leaned forward with genuine interest. What would you suggest specifically? Elena outlined a plan, drawing on strategies she had watched Damien's advisors employ years earlier, a careful mix of visible strength along the border, paired with quiet diplomatic outreach that would let the neighboring pack save face, while backing away from further provocation. The council debated the proposal at length, but by the meeting's end, Kane had adopted it nearly in full, adjusting only minor details before sending Owen to oversee its execution. The strategy worked. Within 2 weeks, the border tensions eased considerably, and word spread through Blackthorn's warriors and advisors alike that the Truce bride from Damien's kingdom had proven herself not merely capable, but genuinely valuable to the pack's security. Elena found herself receiving nods of respect from warriors who had once eyed her with open suspicion, and even Callum began seeking her opinion directly, rather than merely tolerating her presence in the council chamber. It was during this period that Elena noticed something shifting between herself and Kane, something neither of them acknowledged directly, but that colored every interaction with a warmth that had not been there before. He began finding reasons to walk with her after council sessions, discussing matters that had little to do with governance and everything to do with simply enjoying each other's company. He remembered small details about her preference for tea over wine, the way she always paused at the same window each morning to watch the sunrise over the eastern hills, the particular quiet that settled over her whenever conversation turned toward her mother. One evening, walking together through the castle gardens as the last warmth of autumn lingered in the air, Kane stopped abruptly near a bench beneath a wide, half-bare tree, and turned to face her with an expression more open than she had ever seen him wear. "I did not expect this," he said quietly. "Expect what?" Elena asked, though some part of her already understood. "You," he said simply. "I expected to honor the terms of the truce, to treat you with the respect any person deserves, and little more. I did not expect to find myself looking forward to the sound of your voice in the council chamber. I did not expect to find myself walking the length of this castle simply to catch a few more minutes of your company." He paused, studying her carefully, as though searching for permission to continue. "I did not expect to care for you the way I find that I do." Elena's heart pounded against her ribs, a mixture of fear and something warmer, something she had not allowed herself to feel since the day her name had appeared on that treaty. "I did not expect it either," she admitted. "I arrived here, believing I had lost everything worth having. I did not think there was room left in me to feel anything but grief." "And now?" Kane asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now," Elena said slowly, choosing each word with care, "I find that grief has made room for something else, something I am not entirely sure what to do with." Kane reached out, gently, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished, and rested his hand against her cheek. "You do not have to know what to do with it," he said. "Not yet. I am not asking for certainty, Elena. I am only asking that you allow yourself to consider the possibility that what waits for you here might be more than the truce that brought you." Elena did not pull away. Instead, she leaned, almost imperceptibly, into the warmth of his hand, allowing herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel something, without immediately questioning whether she deserved to feel it. "I will consider it," she said softly. "I promise you that much." It was not a declaration. It was not the sweeping, certain confession that stories often demanded of moments like this one. But it was honest, and honesty, Elena had learned since arriving at Blackthorn, was worth more than any grand gesture built on promises that might not hold. They stood together beneath the half-bare tree, until the last light faded entirely from the sky, and when they finally walked back toward the castle, their hands brushed once, briefly, neither of them quite ready to claim more than that small, quiet closeness. But it was enough, for that evening, to plant a seed of something Elena had not expected to find again after Damien's betrayal, the possibility, however fragile, that she might be loved by someone who saw her as a person worth choosing, rather than a piece worth trading. News of her growing closeness with Kane did not stay contained within the walls of Blackthorn Castle for long. Word traveled through diplomatic channels, carried by merchants and messengers who moved between kingdoms, regardless of old rivalries. and it was only a matter of weeks before whispers of it reached the one place Elena had hoped it would take much longer to arrive. Damien's court. She did not know this yet, standing in the garden with Cain's hand still warm against the memory of her cheek, her heart cautiously opening toward a future she had never imagined possible. She only knew that for the first time since her name had been signed away on a treaty she never agreed to, she felt something close to hope. She did not yet know how quickly that hope would be tested. The news reached Damien on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, delivered by a merchant returning from Blackthorn territory who mentioned, almost in passing, that the Truce bride had become something of a fixture in the rival Alpha's council chamber, respected by warriors and advisors alike, and rumored to have grown close to Cain himself. Damien's advisors watched carefully as the king's expression shifted from mild interest to something colder, something none of them had expected to see. Close in what sense? Damien asked, his voice deceptively even. The merchant, sensing the danger in the question, but unable to avoid answering it directly, shifted uncomfortably. It is only rumor, my king, but the servants speak of walks together in the gardens, of the Alpha seeking her counsel more than any advisors. Some say, he hesitated. Say it, Damien said, his voice sharpening. Some say he intends to make her his mate, in truth, and not merely in name. The silence that followed stretched long enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable. Edwin, the elder advisor who had once tried to soften the terms of Elena's departure, watched Damien's face carefully, recognizing the particular stillness that had always preceded the king's worst decisions. She was given away to secure a truce, Damien said finally, his voice low and controlled in a way that did not match the anger visible in his eyes. Not to become Blackthorn's queen. My king, Edwin said carefully. The terms of the treaty made no restriction on what became of her once she arrived. If Alpha Cain has chosen to elevate her status within his own territory, that falls within his rights as her. I am aware of the terms of the treaty, Damien snapped, cutting him off. I wrote them. He rose from his seat and paced the length of the council chamber, his mind working through implications that had nothing to do with the peace he had claimed to be protecting when he signed Elena away, and everything to do with a wound he had not expected this news to open. He had told himself, in the weeks since her departure, that he had done what any responsible king would do, sacrificed a personal attachment for the greater good of his kingdom. He had told himself that Elena would understand, eventually, that his choice had been necessary, rather than cruel. He had not expected to feel this sharp, unwelcome twist in his chest at the thought of her thriving in another man's court, respected by another man's counsel, walking gardens beside another man who apparently understood her value in ways he himself had failed to demonstrate when it mattered most. It was not love, he told himself. It could not be love, not after the ease with which he had signed her away. But it was something, some tangled combination of pride and possessiveness, and a dawning, uncomfortable awareness that he had discarded something more valuable than he had realized at the time. I want more information, he said finally, turning back to his advisors. I want to know exactly what is happening in Blackthorn territory, and I want to know whether this truce can be renegotiated. Edwin's expression grew wary. My king, the truce was signed in good faith. Reopening its terms now, simply because circumstances have changed in ways you did not anticipate, risks undoing everything that agreement was meant to secure. I am not asking for your opinion on the wisdom of the request, Damien said sharply. I am asking you to find a way to accomplish it. The room fell silent again, and Edwin, recognizing the futility of further argument, bowed his head slightly and agreed to begin drafting correspondence to Blackthorn's court, though privately, he doubted any request to alter the truce's terms would be well received, particularly if the rumors about Cain's growing affection for Elena held any truth at all. Word of Damien's inquiries reached Cain within days, carried by his own network of informants who had long kept watch over developments in the neighboring kingdom. He read the reports in the privacy of his study, his expression unreadable, before summoning Elena to join him. She arrived to find him standing near the window, the evening light casting long shadows across the room, a folded parchment resting on the desk beside him. What is it? She asked, sensing immediately that something had shifted. Damien has begun asking questions, Cain said carefully, watching her reaction, about the terms of the truce, about whether they might be reconsidered. Elena's stomach dropped. a cold, familiar dread settling over her, despite the months of distance she had put between herself and her former kingdom. Reconsidered how? My informants are not certain, Kane admitted. But given the timing, given the rumors that have clearly reached his court regarding the two of us, I suspect his interest has less to do with diplomatic strategy and more to do with wounded pride. Elena crossed the room to stand beside him, staring out at the same hills she had grown to love over the past months, hills that had come to feel more like home than the kingdom she had left behind. He does not want me, she said quietly. He never wanted me. He simply does not want anyone else to have what he decided he no longer needed. That is often how possessiveness works, Kane said. It rarely requires actual desire. Only the discomfort of watching something you discarded become valuable in someone else's hands. Elena turned to face him, searching his expression for any sign of doubt, any hesitation about the growing closeness between them now that it faced a real, tangible threat. She found none, only quiet resolve, and something fiercer beneath it, something that told her, without a single word spoken, that he had no intention of allowing Damien to reclaim what he no longer had any right to. "What will you do?" she asked. "Nothing rash," Kane said. "The truth still matters, even if Damien's motives for questioning it have grown petty. I will not throw away months of peace over his wounded ego. But I will make it very clear, through every diplomatic channel available to me, that the terms of that treaty made no provision for reclaiming what was given, and that you are not a possession to be returned simply because its previous owner has developed regret." Something in Elena's chest loosened at those words, a tension she had not fully realized she was carrying, until it began to ease. "Thank you," she said softly. "You do not need to thank me for refusing to hand you back to a man who never deserved you in the first place," Kane said, his voice gentler now. "But know this, Elena. Whatever Damien attempts, whatever pressure he brings to bear, I will not let it change what has grown between us. Not unless that is truly what you want." "It is not," Elena said, with more certainty than she had expected to feel. "It is not what I want at all." Kane reached for her hand, and this time, neither of them hesitated. Their fingers intertwined, a small but deliberate gesture that felt, in that moment, like a promise neither of them was willing to break, regardless of what storms Damien's wounded pride might yet stir up between their two kingdoms. Outside, the sun continued its slow descent toward the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep, burning red, and Elena found herself standing at the edge of a choice far larger than anything she had faced since the day her name had been signed onto that treaty. This time, however, the choice was entirely her own, and she intended to make it without apology. The formal request arrived at Blackthorn Castle 2 weeks later, carried by a delegation dressed in the colors of Damien's kingdom, led by Edwin himself, whose weary expression suggested he had argued against this mission and lost. Kane received them in the great hall, seated at the head of a long table with Elena at his side, a placement that was itself a quiet statement about where she now stood within his court. Edwin bowed formally before beginning. "Alpha Kane, my king sends greetings and wishes to discuss a matter of some sensitivity regarding the terms of your truce." "Speak plainly," Kane said. "I have little patience for diplomatic circling today." Edwin hesitated only briefly before continuing. "King Damien requests that the Lady Elena be permitted to return to her home kingdom, given that the immediate threat of war which necessitated her transfer has now passed. He proposes a revised arrangement that would maintain the truce, while allowing her to resume her place within his court." The words hung in the air, cold and calculated despite their diplomatic wrapping. Elena felt every eye in the hall turn toward her, waiting to see how she would respond, though the decision, technically, belonged to Kane as the ruling alpha who had accepted the original terms. "And what does King Damien propose in exchange for this revision?" Kane asked, his voice carefully neutral. "He offers additional trade concessions," Edwin said. "Access to the southern grain routes, reduced tariffs on goods moving between our territories. He is prepared to be generous in demonstrating his continued commitment to peace between our kingdoms." Kane's expression did not change, but Elena, who had come to know him well enough to read the small shifts in his posture, saw the tension gathering in his shoulders. "You are asking me to trade a person for grain routes," he said, as though she were a resource to be renegotiated whenever it becomes convenient for your king. "That is not the intention," Edwin said, though his voice lacked conviction. King Damien simply believes. I do not care what King Damien believes, Cain interrupted, his voice sharpening for the first time since the delegation's arrival. I care what the treaty states, and the treaty made no provision for reclaiming what was freely given. Lady Elena is not a piece of property to be traded back and forth based on shifting political convenience. Elena, who had remained silent through the exchange, finally spoke, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. Perhaps, she said, drawing every eye in the hall toward her, you should ask me what I want, rather than negotiating my future, as though I were still incapable of speaking for myself. Edwin turned toward her, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. My lady, King Damien believes. I do not care what King Damien believes either, Elena said, echoing Cain's words with a calm firmness that surprised even herself. I care what is true, and the truth is that I have no intention of returning to a kingdom that traded me away the moment I became inconvenient, only to reconsider that decision the moment I became valuable somewhere else. The hall fell utterly silent. Edwin's expression shifted from discomfort to something closer to genuine surprise, as though he had not expected such clarity, such open defiance, from the woman he remembered leaving Damien's court in tears months earlier. You understand, he said carefully, that this refusal may not be well received by my king. I understand, Elena said, that my king's opinion of my choices stopped mattering to me the moment he decided my worth was equal to a signature on a treaty. Tell him that. Tell him exactly that, if you wish, though I suspect he already understands it far better than he is willing to admit. Edwin studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, an old fondness she had not expected to see from a man who had once stood silently by, while her fate was decided without her consent. For what it is worth, my lady, he said quietly, I argued against this mission from the start. I believed then, as I believe now, that you deserved better than what this kingdom offered you. Thank you, Edwin, Elena said, and she meant it. That means more than you know. The delegation departed shortly after, carrying Cain's formal refusal, along with Elena's own unambiguous rejection of the proposed arrangement. But the matter did not end there, as both Elena and Cain had suspected it would not. Within days, word arrived that Damien had grown increasingly agitated by the refusal, his advisors reporting that he had taken to pacing his council chamber late into the night, muttering about broken agreements and disrespected authority, though none of his advisors dared point out that the authority he felt disrespected had never truly belonged to him in the first place, not where Elena's own choices were concerned. It was Owen who brought the most troubling news to Cain's study one evening, his usually easy expression replaced by something far more serious. There is word that Damien is mustering warriors along the border, he said. Not in numbers large enough to suggest outright war, not yet, but enough to suggest he is considering a more forceful approach to reclaiming what he believes is rightfully his. Cain's jaw tightened. He would risk breaking the truce entirely over wounded pride? Men have started wars over less, Owen said grimly, and I do not think this is only about pride any longer, Cain. I think he has convinced himself that losing her was a mistake he intends to correct, regardless of the cost. Elena, who had been present for the report, felt a familiar cold dread settle over her, though it was tempered now by something new, a fierce, protective anger on behalf of the life she had built within these walls, the people who had come to trust her, the future she had only just begun to imagine for herself. He will not simply take me, she said firmly. Whatever warriors he musters, whatever force he threatens, I will not go back to being a piece, traded away for someone else's convenience. Not again. Cain turned to her, his expression fierce with a protectiveness that matched her own resolve. You will not have to, he said. I did not fight to build this territory, to earn the loyalty of these people, simply to hand away what matters most to me the moment someone else decides they want it back. The words settled over Elena with the weight of a promise, one she believed with a certainty she had not felt since arriving at Blackthorn's gates as a frightened, betrayed stranger. Whatever storm Damien intended to bring to their door, she would not face it as the powerless girl who had once stood silently by, while her fate was decided for her. She would face it as herself, standing beside a man who had never once treated her as anything less than an equal, and she intended to make certain that whatever came next, the choice of her future would remain, finally and permanently, her own. The days that followed passed in a tense rhythm of preparation and watchfulness. Kane doubled the patrols along Blackthorn's southern border, though he was careful to keep the build-up measured, unwilling to give Damien any excuse to claim that Blackthorn had broken the truce first. Callum, who had once regarded Elena with open suspicion, now worked alongside her almost constantly, drawing on her knowledge of Damien's court to anticipate his likely strategies. "He will not risk open war," Elena said during one late strategy session, studying a map spread across the council table. "His kingdom cannot afford it, not after the losses from the conflict that led to this truce in the first place. But he may attempt something smaller, a show of force meant to intimidate rather than truly threaten." "A show of force can still turn into war," Callum pointed out, "if handled poorly on either side." "Then we will not handle it poorly," Kane said firmly. "We will meet whatever he brings with strength, but we will not be the ones who strike first." The confrontation came a week later, when word arrived that Damien himself, along with a modest but visible contingent of warriors, had arrived at the border between their two territories, requesting a formal meeting to discuss what he called an urgent matter, requiring the presence of both alphas. Elena's stomach twisted at the news, old wounds reopening despite the months of distance and growth that had passed since she last stood in Damien's presence. But beneath the fear, she felt something steadier, a resolve that had not existed within her the day she walked through Blackthorn's gates as a stranger. "I want to go," she said, when Kane informed her of the meeting's terms. "I want to face him directly. I am tired of being spoken about as though I have no voice in matters that concern my own life." Kane studied her carefully, clearly weighing the risks of allowing her to attend against the importance of what she was asking for. "It will not be easy," he said finally, facing him again, in front of witnesses, after everything he did. "No," Elena agreed. "But avoiding it will not make it easier. I need him, and everyone else who witnesses this, to understand clearly that I am no longer the woman who left his kingdom in silence." Kane nodded, respect evident in his expression. "Then you will stand beside me, not behind me. Beside me, as my equal, for anyone who cares to notice the difference." They rode out to the border together 3 days later, accompanied by a modest escort of warriors, arriving at a wide, open field that had been chosen as neutral ground for the meeting. Damien was already waiting, flanked by Edwin and a handful of his own guards, his posture rigid with a tension that Elena recognized immediately, though it no longer stirred the same anxious devotion it once had. "Elena," Damien said, his eyes moving over her with an expression that mixed surprise and something closer to longing than she expected. "You look well." "I am well," she said simply, refusing to offer him more warmth than the greeting required. Damien's gaze shifted to Kane, and something colder settled into his expression. "I have come to discuss the terms of our arrangement," he said. "Circumstances have changed since the treaty was first signed. I believe it is time to reconsider certain aspects of it." "The treaty was clear," Kane said evenly. "There was no provision for reclaiming what was given. Elena is not a term to be renegotiated." "She was given to secure peace," Damien said, his voice rising slightly. "A peace that no longer requires her presence in your territory, given that the immediate threat which prompted this arrangement has long since passed." "The threat may have passed," Elena said, stepping forward before Kane could respond. "But the reasons I have chosen to remain have nothing to do with the treaty any longer. I am not staying because a piece of paper obligates me to. I am staying because I choose to." Damien's expression flickered, something raw and unguarded breaking through his careful composure for the first time. "You cannot mean that," he said. "Elena, whatever has happened here, whatever influence has been exerted over you, you belong to—" "I belong to no one," Elena interrupted, her voice sharp enough to carry across the field, loud enough for every warrior present to hear clearly. "Not to you, not to this kingdom, not to anyone who believes they have the right to decide my future without my consent. You taught me that lesson yourself, the day you signed my name onto that treaty, without a single word of warning." The field fell silent, the tension between the two parties thickening with every passing second. Damien's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides, though he made no move to close the distance between them. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier authority. "I see that now. I should never have signed you away." I let politics blind me to what truly mattered, and I have regretted it every day since word reached me of your life here. Your regret does not change what you did, Elena said, though her voice softened slightly, not with forgiveness, but with the weary clarity of someone who had finally stopped needing his approval to feel whole. You had years to show me I mattered to you, and instead you showed me, in the space of a single afternoon, exactly how little I did. I have spent months rebuilding myself from that lesson. I will not let you undo that progress, simply because you have finally realized what you lost. Damien took a step forward, desperation breaking through his composure entirely now. Elena, please, give me the chance to make this right. Come home, and I will prove to you that. She is home, Kane said, his voice cutting through Damien's plea with quiet, unshakable authority. Whatever claim you believe you still hold over her, ended the moment you traded her away without her consent. She has built a life here, a place among my people, respected and valued for exactly who she is. I will not stand aside and watch you try to reclaim that, simply because your pride cannot accept the consequences of your own choices. Damien's eyes moved between Elena and Kane, taking in the way they stood together, the quiet strength of the bond that had clearly grown between them, undeniable to anyone with eyes to see it. Whatever hope he had carried into this meeting seemed to crumble in that moment, replaced by a bitter, humiliated understanding that the woman standing before him was no longer within his reach, and had not been for some time. "This is not over," he said finally, though the threat in his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "The council will hear of this. There will be consequences for—"
"There will be no consequences,"
Elena said firmly.
"except the ones you have already brought upon yourself. You traded away someone who loved you without condition, and you did it so easily that it never once occurred to you that she might build a better life somewhere else."
"That is not my failure to answer for, Damien. It is entirely your own." She turned, without waiting for his response, and walked back toward her horse, her spine straight, her steps steady, every part of her radiating a strength that Damien had never once seen in her during all the years she had spent hoping for his approval. Kane fell into step beside her, and together, they rode back toward Blackthorn territory, leaving Damien standing alone in the middle of the field, surrounded by warriors who had witnessed, in full, the moment his last claim over her had finally, irrevocably, broken. Winter arrived in Blackthorn territory not long after that final confrontation, blanketing the hills in soft white snow, and settling a quiet, peaceful rhythm over the castle that had, for months, carried the tension of an uncertain future. Word of what had happened at the border spread quickly through both kingdoms, carried by warriors and merchants alike, until it became something close to legend, the Truce bride who had stood before the king, who discarded her, and refused, without hesitation, to be reclaimed. Elena found herself, in the weeks that followed, receiving a kind of respect she had never known within Damien's court, not merely from Blackthorn's warriors and advisors, who had already come to value her counsel, but from the smaller packs and territories under Blackthorn's protection, who spoke of her now not as an outsider forced into their midst, but as a leader who had proven her loyalty through action rather than birthright. Callum, who had once regarded her with the deepest suspicion of anyone within the castle, found her one snowy afternoon reviewing trade reports in the study that had slowly become as much hers as it was Kane's, and set down a cup of warm tea beside her without a word of explanation, a small gesture that spoke louder than any formal apology could have. "I owe you an admission," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "When you first arrived, I believed you would be a liability, a weakness in Blackthorn's defenses, a piece of Damien's kingdom planted within our walls." "I remember," Elena said, a faint smile touching her lips. "You made that quite clear." "I was wrong," Callum said simply. "You have proven yourself more loyal to this territory, more valuable to its people, than many who were born within these walls. I wanted you to know that I recognize it, even if I was slow to admit it." Elena set down her pen, touched by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you, Callum. That means more to me than you realize." It was that evening, as snow continued to fall softly outside the study windows, that Kane found her still working by candlelight, her focus intent on a proposal for expanding trade routes with a neighboring territory that had, until recently, been hesitant to deal directly with Blackthorn. "You work too hard," he said, leaning against the doorframe, watching her with the same quiet admiration that had grown steadily since her arrival. "I have a great deal to prove," she said, though there was no bitterness in the words, only quiet determination. "You have already proven it," Kane said, crossing the room to stand beside her chair. "To everyone in this castle, to every pack under our protection, to Damien himself, whether he wishes to admit it or not." He paused, and something in his expression shifted into a careful vulnerability she had come to recognize as rare, reserved only for their most private moments together. "There is only one person left whose recognition might still matter to you." Elena looked up at him, her heart quickening despite the many months that had passed since she first felt this particular flutter of anticipation in his presence. "And who is that?" "Yourself," Kane said softly. "Do you believe it yet? That you belong here, not as a truce bride, not as a piece traded to secure peace, but as someone who has earned every bit of respect this territory holds for her?" Elena considered the question carefully, thinking back over the months since her arrival, the grief she had carried through Blackthorn's gates, the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding herself into someone who no longer measured her worth by another person's approval. She thought of the families she had helped during the sickness that had threatened their livestock, of the strategies she had helped develop to protect Blackthorn's borders, of the quiet, steady respect she had earned from people who had every reason, at first, to doubt her. "Yes," she said finally, and she meant it completely. "I believe it." Kane knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that had defined every moment of their growing bond since the day she arrived as a stranger at his gates. "Then I would ask you something," he said, "not as the alpha who accepted a truce, but as the man who has come to love you more completely than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone." Elena's breath caught, understanding immediately what he intended to ask, and finding, to her own quiet astonishment, that she felt no fear at all, only a steady, certain readiness she had not known she possessed. "Elena," Kane said, "will you stand beside me, not as a truce bride, but as my true mate, my equal in every sense, ruling this territory together, for as long as we both shall live?" Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, though they carried none of the grief that had once defined her nights within these walls. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Yes, I will." The ceremony that followed, held as winter began to loosen its grip and the first signs of spring crept back into the hills surrounding Blackthorn Castle, was unlike anything Elena had imagined for herself during the years she had spent believing her future belonged to Damien. It was smaller than the grand celebrations she had once dreamed of, but it was filled with a warmth and genuine joy that no amount of royal spectacle could have matched. Warriors who had once regarded her with suspicion stood among the witnesses, their expressions open with respect and affection. Grace wept openly through the entire ceremony, and Owen's booming laugh carried through the celebration long into the evening. Even Callum, standing near the front of the gathered crowd, allowed himself an unguarded smile as Kane and Elena exchanged the vows that would bind them together, not through obligation or political necessity, but through a choice made freely, by two people who had found, against every expectation, exactly what they needed in each other. As the ceremony concluded, and Elena stood beside Kane before the gathered crowd, now formally recognized as Blackthorn's true queen, she thought of the frightened, betrayed young woman who had walked through those gates months earlier, believing herself discarded and worthless, believing her story had already reached its saddest possible ending. She thought of Damien, standing alone in that field, watching the last of his claim over her crumble into nothing, and she thought of everything she had built since then, not through the treaty that had brought her here, but through her own strength, her own choices, her own refusal to let another person's betrayal define the rest of her life. Word of her coronation reached Damien's court within days, carried by the same networks of merchants and messengers who had first delivered news of her growing bond with Kane months earlier. He received the news in silence, staring out over a kingdom that suddenly felt smaller and lonelier than it ever had before, understanding, finally and completely, that the truce he had engineered to protect his throne had cost him something far more valuable than he had ever imagined it could. Not merely a woman he had once claimed to love, but the chance to have been the kind of man who deserved her loyalty in the first place. But within Blackthorn's walls, none of that mattered any longer. Elena stood beside Kane, as spring sunlight broke fully across the hills, ruling a territory that had once been meant as her prison, and had become, Instead, the truest home she had ever known. She had arrived as a piece traded away to secure someone else's peace. She left that field of grief and betrayal behind entirely, and rose, finally and completely, as a queen who had claimed her own throne, her own future, and her own heart, on terms that belonged to no one but herself.